So I want to welcome all of you to Revolution Books and welcome Jason Stanley. And welcome those who are listening or watching on Facebook Live or other social media. So welcome to all the people who are participating in that way. This is, for those of you who this is the first time you're here, for those of you who are watching online, this is Revolution Books. Revolution Books is the political, the intellectual, and the cultural center of a movement for an actual revolution. It's not a marketing slogan, Revolution Books. It's what we are for. It's why we exist. It's what we're doing here. And this revolution is based on a development in the science of communism by the revolutionary leader Bob Avakian, which I will tell you more about that a little bit later in the program. But one thing that might strike you right off the bat is at the center of this movement for revolution is a bookstore. Why? Because a big part of this new communism is a method of understanding the world, a scientific method of understanding the world as it actually is. And to do that, you need to know the world. To change the world, you need to know the world. And this bookstore, in the works it has, the revolutionary theory, the political theory, the philosophy theory, the art that's in the bookstore, and the literature that can take you to places to imagine and understand and experience what it was like in past epochs of human history, past history of the United States, novels that enable you to get inside the lives of other people today all around the world, from Africa, the African diaspora, to Asia, to Latin America, Europe, and right here at home, people you don't know. All of that is part of what the story is about. And also fiction can enable you to imagine what doesn't yet exist, as can revolutionary theory. So this is the political, cultural, intellectual center of a movement for an actual revolution. I'm going to speak more about that a little bit later. But first I'm going to tell you about the agenda for tonight. After this introduction to Jason Stanley, he's going to talk for a while. And after Jason's done speaking, I'm going to come back and tell you a bit more about Refuse Fascism, Revolution Books, and the movement for an actual revolution, and the new communism. And I'm going to do that all real quick. So you're going to have some work to do when you leave here to actually understand it even more deeply. But I hope it introduces to you and entices you to get into all of this more deeply. We need to change the world drastically and desperately and urgently, and you're needed to be a part of that. So look, this is a very important program tonight. It's quite urgent. We are facing an existential crisis for humanity and the planet. For those of you who have heard me speak before, whether for Refuse Fascism or on behalf of the movement for actual revolution, you've heard me say this before, but it is actually a fact that we are facing a climate crisis that is being exacerbated in the throwing out of science itself in the last week by the Trump-Pence regime, and that we could actually be in a situation where the planet is uninhabitable for many species, including our own. It's also an existential crisis in the sense that we have a president who says if we have nukes, why can't we use them? And we're in a world right now of hot spots all over the place, each of which are being intensified by this regime. And it's an existential crisis for much of humanity. You think about there are 65 million refugees wandering the globe, both from the climate crisis and the wars. For people, millions and millions, tens of millions of people, there's an existential crisis. And now, for half of humanity, the question of being able to control your own body is up for grabs. So this is a very serious moment, and this book, which is over here, and Jason's work here, How Fascism Works, the Politics of Us and Them, is very important at this moment. This book, in describing 10 political and ideological forms that fascism takes, is sounding an alarm. And Us and Them, the politics of Us and Them, is very appropriate, and it's something you can learn about from Jason, but also in terms of this story, because Us and Them is the history of this country from its formation in slavery and the genocide of the native people, from how it's the patriarchy that's been woven into the fabric of this society from its very beginning. All of that has taken new and grotesque form under this fascist regime. So this is what he's going to talk about. Then we're going to have a conversation after I tell you a bit more about the store, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So that's the 3 parts of the program after I'm done in just a minute. Jason's going to speak. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the store. We're going to have a conversation, and then there'll be a Q&A from the audience, and then you can purchase books, talk to Jason individually, and talk amongst yourselves, talk to me. So with that, I do want to introduce Jason Stanley. We have met once before. He's been tirelessly touring the country, which has meant that he's still standing but can only stand. He's going to speak now. He's a professor at Yale University. Previously, he was teaching at Rutgers, nearby here. His book right before this was called How Propaganda Works. But this is the book that we are speaking about tonight. So join me in welcoming Jason Stanley from Yale University.
Thank you. Thank you, and it's an honor being at Revolution Books. I'm a great admirer of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, his son Makoma. In general, the shelves of this bookstore are 50% of what's informed the writing of my book. So why do I say that? I should begin when I was first sort of marketing this book. So the idea was I was kind of sick of the term populist. Like populist is, the populist movement in the early 20th century was not, in the late 19th century was not some sort of negative nativist movement. Populism is used to obscure the particular structure of what I think one faces in multiple ways. And that structure is a nativist, anti-immigrant, well, it has a certain structure of the sort that I describe in the book. And I wanted to say this, it's legitimate to call this structure fascism. Fascism, the literature on fascism, for those of you who are acquainted with it, is very riven. Some people say the Nazis weren't fascist. So it's that, the typologies are complex. But I think there are some generalizations that apply that when you list them look very familiar. So now you will, when I first was thinking about the book, people were like, well, that's kind of edgy to call certain structures fascist nowadays. But then Madeleine Albright published Fascism: A Warning, and no one is going to confuse Madeleine Albright with a radical. So it was like, phew, family happy. So I should say something about the difference between my take and what I think of the end of democracy literature that you see nowadays, like Albright, my colleague Tim Snyder, from whom I've learned a tremendous amount, but you still in this end of democracy literature, you get this idea that there's a worry that it's presented as, oh, we were a stable liberal democracy, and then this foreign invasion happened, fascism. That's not where I start from. So here in Black Reconstruction, in Du Bois's 1935 great work of history, when in the chapter The White Worker, have you heard that phrase? It's chapter 2 of Black Reconstruction. No, it's chapter 1 of Black Reconstruction. Here's how he ends it. America thus stepped forward in the first blossoming of the modern age and added to the art of beauty, gift of the Renaissance, and to freedom of belief, gift of Martin Luther and Leo X, a vision of democratic self-government, the domination of political life by the intelligent decision of free and self-sustaining men. What an idea and what an area for its realization. Endless land of richest fertility, natural resources such as earth seldom exhibited before, a population infinite of variety, of universal gift, burned in the fires of poverty and caste, yearning toward the unknown God, and self-reliant pioneers unafraid of man or devil. It was the supreme adventure in the last great battle of the West for that human freedom which would release the human spirit from lower lust for mere meat and set it to free and dream and sing. And then some unjust God leaned laughing over the ramparts of heaven, and dropped a black man in the midst. It transformed the world. It turned democracy back to Roman imperialism and fascism. It restored caste and oligarchy. It replaced freedom with slavery and withdrew the name of humanity from the vast majority of human beings. So Du Bois was conceiving of the kind of psychological wages of whiteness exploitation in American politics, when the white worker is lured into supporting policies that run against their own material interests, into pairing across race lines. Arendt says in Origins of Totalitarianism, fascism focuses on this artificial identity of race and gets you to a race, so it draws people from all the social classes. So Du Bois was labeling what was happening in the United States fascism, that structure. Du Bois in The World in Africa, 1945 book, begins by saying, look, everybody knows what Hitler is mad about. Hitler's mad about losing the African colonies in Versailles, Germany's African colonies in Versailles. So this is a theme of fascism, empire. Part 2 of Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism is called imperialism. She said that was the most important part. Césaire, of course, makes the theme. So makes clear that when you do terrible things in other countries, it's going to come back to your country. So if you target the Middle East, that's politics will come back to your country. And Césaire says when you treat people that way, like torturing them, then that will eventually spread. People are like, hey, we can torture people. So my book is based on American history, and it's very much rooted in American history. It's not a fascism book about Europe, and we know that this structure, fascism is very familiar to us. It's a extreme right movement, so people say fascism is leftist because it's socialism. Well, never has there been a fascist party that's been linked with like the left wing. I mean, when it gets any electoral success, it's linked to the to religious conservatives, certain religious conservatives, big business, anti-labor. So these are structures that are familiar. We don't need, just as Europe doesn't need us, Steve Bannon, to teach them about this structure, so we don't need Europe. But right now, we're seeing an international linkage between these movements, and we're seeing some of the same historical patterns. We're seeing the same politics. So we're seeing universities targeted as like left bastions of leftist ideology. I was talking on the phone to a Brazilian journalist a week or so ago, and he was like, and Bolsonaro originally just said that he would eliminate philosophy and sociology. Then you can't really do that. You can't eliminate philosophy and sociology. So there's no way given the funding structure. So then he said he'd eliminate funding to the 3 major universities that had the big anti-fascist protests. Because of course, where does protest, the one place protest starts are in universities. So, and then he cut 30% from the general university budget. And the Brazilian journalist said, so can you give us advice on how to fight the attack on the universities? Because in America, your universities have been attacked. If you look at what Scott Walker did in Wisconsin, to take an extreme example. But everywhere you hear mainstreams the message that like universities are bastions of cultural Marxism, suppressing free speech. With, of course, what Donald Trump rallies are called free speech rallies. There's a 1929 this move, of course, free speech is vital, actual free speech, but the hypocritical use of free speech to like push anti-BDS legislation at the same time, or like forbid discussion of divestment from fossil fuels and things like that at the same time as you trumpet free speech. Something strange is happening. So there's attack on the universities. And then there's the reason that this bookstore is so central. There's the path. I just came back from Germany and from Berlin, and my parents, my father grew up in Berlin, came here and arrived August 11th, 1939. He was almost 7. And so they're having a big fight about their memory culture. So the past is at the center of things. So Alexander Gauland, one of the 2 leaders of the Alternative für Deutschland, said no other country is faced with a fake past. This might have been Höcke, the other leader. In the middle of Berlin, there's the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, and they want to take it down because they say that. So we're at the stage where we're trying to take the monuments, the original bad monuments, down. They're at the stage where they've taken the original bad monuments down, they've put up good monuments, and now the politics is about taking them down. So monuments is part of the, but memory and the past and history is essential. And the wars are about memory. Like Poland's putting up memorials to non-existent groups of Poles brought gas in Auschwitz. Although, of course, many Poles, non-Jewish Poles, did die, were killed by the Germans. They were not brought to Auschwitz, and it's a fictional history. Hungary is doing the same thing. And the United States, of course, is all about fictional history, as this book. People argue, so there's this centrality in anti-fascist movements of the truth, because fascism tries to create a mythologized past, and the mythologized past has a particular structure. The mythologized past has a structure where harkening back to empire. Look at the UK. Like, so many people in the UK thought the EU was an invasion. The UK is not an empire anymore. The UK is a former empire. Like, the EU was helping them. It's that they were all together and, but that empire thinking. Like, we were an empire, we were great. So that structure is core to this uniform thing. The idea is there are interlopers. Interlopers ruined things. The interlopers brought liberal values, respect for equality. So you have this attack. Viktor Orban said in that crazy interview with Bernard-Henri Lévy last week, where he was like, I am Christianity. Viktor Orban said, liberalism is political correctness. And I think he's right. But you have this attack on liberalism. You have this structure, this questioning of you have this masking of multiple, Andy and I were talking about this earlier, this representing of multiple perspectives. The thing about history is it's experienced by different groups at different times. So you have this painting of multiple perspectives as relativism. There's only one truth. There's one truth, and that truth was different. Like, it is true that these women were treated like this, women were treated like this at this point, and men were treated like that. There's not just one story. There is one truth, but not just one way the world is experienced. So you have this sort of detachment in this politics from reality. You have this attempt in this politics to replace truth with history being an example, to make everything an us-them narrative. And Du Bois, in the final chapter of this great work, The Propaganda of History, talks about this. He says, if you use history for social cohesion rather than truth, that is always, then you're going to lose all basis. So all basis of reality. So we have in this politics like an attempt to say, like reality is a famous liberal bias. Remember that? An attempt to represent reality as one side of a coin, of like an us-them distinction. Like, oh, they're just using reality. And it's tricky, right? Because a core fascist propaganda can consist of true claims like that immigrant raped someone, which might be perfectly true, right? So, then you say, well, immigrants have lower crime rates than non-immigrants and people, and that doesn't change the reality. So reality is a complex, but the idea is to boil things down to like a simple narrative, to a certain structure, and that's the structure I try to describe in How Fascism Works. The structure of there's the good, hardworking people who have a certain identity. They're Hindus, they're Jews, they're Christians, they're whites. And then there's the out groups, which are out to get your women. And the Rohingya, what happened in Myanmar is the Rohingya men, 3 Rohingya men raped a Rankine woman in 2012. They consigned the entire Rohingya population into around 200 villages, and incredible propaganda was directed against them of that sort. And then this ethnic cleansing began. So you have this structure. And then the idea is that liberals, cosmopolitans, they're behind they're behind race mixing, they're behind making the policies that allow the interlopers in. So you find this structure everywhere. And you find this, and we see anti-Semitism happening because who are the liberal cosmopolitans? Well, traditionally, and we see a lot of confusion about anti-Semitism because, the liberal cosmopolitans for the anti-Semite are the Jews. Now, even if that's a dangerous trope anyway, because you could aim, they could be the leftists, they could be, but Judeo-Bolsheviks. Like if you're an anti-Semite, you hear this paranoid theory as about Jews. And of course, Israeli politics makes that much more complicated because Israel is the government of Israel is a far-right ethno-nationalist government right now, or I guess they were a few days ago. But what you see, but you also see here now in the book. What I do is I try to explain certain things like the connection. I try to explain like these different, fascism involves these different right-wing movements like libertarianism and religious conservatives in a marriage of convenience around nationalism. And I try to explain why that happens, like the overlaps in each case. Like with religious conservatives, it can be like, oh, the picture of the mythic past is what they admire. With libertarians, it's the devotion to social Darwinism, the belief that power makes right. And what fascism does is lifts that up to groups. It says certain groups are just more hardworking than other groups and have more value and have won more on the free market. So the last chapter is called Arbeit macht frei, which work shall make you free, which is emblazoned on the gates of Auschwitz. And it's about what white Americans mean when they say black Americans are lazy, which is what the Germans meant by Arbeit macht frei. Jews were lazy. They worked in banks. They did no physical work. They must be forced to work for free. So there's this structure. The out group are lazy. They're criminal. And what's the notion of law and order here? It's a law and order politics. The notion of law and order, I talk about when I talk about the Central Park 5 case. I introduced this notion with Jeff Sessions' comment about Donald Trump during the Central Park 5 case. Trump in 2016, this is funny because he just tweeted about the 94 crime bill, or tragic, whatever. But Trump in 2016 said the Central Park 5 are still guilty. So what is meant by that? What's meant by that is, and Sessions said about Trump, you can tell he's going to be a law and order president by his reaction to the Central Park 5 case. Now, what does that mean? That's not any notion of law and order I recognize. That's not because they're completely innocent. So what notion of law and order is that? It's the fascist notion of law and order, that the out group is by their nature criminal, that non-white, black in America, black Americans are, black men particularly are by their nature criminal. Something that is explored in chapter 2 of Khalil Muhammad's book, Condemnation of Blackness, on the shelves over there. So, and you have the same thing with, I have a piece in the New York Times called Who is a Criminal? And I use my grandmother's memoir of Berlin in the 1930s. And there's a chapter that's very interesting because it explains how things go slowly. And at first she says, German Jews, my friends weren't worried over Bridge because they said they're only arresting the criminal Jews. So this structure is the idea. And now what I've done in this book is I've lifted this structure out of a particular time and place. I've said, no, it's not just applicable to Nazi Germany or just applicable to Italy. It's a general structure. And of course, for Mussolini, race played less central of a role than it did for Hitler. But I guess finally I should end on a couple descriptions of dissimilar. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to describe a general structure of politics that you see. What I find is that in different countries, people pick up my book, and insofar as it resonates with their particular far-right movement, they're like, wow. So Bolsonaro in Brazil, extremely militaristic, extremely macho, patriarchy is central. An old point in fascism politics is the centrality of patriarchy. The F scale, which was originally in the authoritarian personality, that was originally going to be the fascist personality, but then because of the politics of the time, they made it the authoritarian personality. And the F scale measures how susceptible you are, supposed to measure how susceptible you are to fascism. And being raised with an authoritarian patriarchal father was sort of primary signal. Of course, there's a whole book about this, The Mass Psychology of Fascism by Wilhelm Reich, where he's like, why did in 1905 did the soldiers just hand over their guns to the Tsar to be shot? And he said, because he was their father. And people don't realize how good, incisive that comment by Kanye West was when he met with Trump in the White House, where he said, when Trump ran for office, I grew up in a house without a father, and I thought, I have a daddy. I have a dad now. So that politics, the father of the nation. An empire. And I'll conclude with a commonality and a difference between the kinds of politics I'm describing then and now. So empire. So first, I think of fascism as a set of tactics that you can aim in different directions. And in the mid-20th century, this kind of politics was used for empire. It was used to get empire back. That's why all discussions of fascism discuss empire. But now it's more about building walls than expansion. It's more about keeping out. This is important to think about. One point is there's no more, we don't think of the world like that. There's no more, expanding space is not, of course, Putin did take over Crimea, so there are exceptions here, but things don't go with, Timothy Snyder argues that this mechanism is not used to lead people that way towards expanding empire. It's meant to sort of seal things off and hand power over to oligarchs. But nevertheless, empire is utterly central. That's why, I started thinking about this topic again when I did 2 summer schools in Budapest in 2009 and 2010. And at 2009, it was wonderful. And 2010, everyone was talking about Trianon. I was like, what the hell? Trianon? The treaty where Greater Hungary was lost in 1919. And they became obsessed by that. And that was what Orban did, to remind people of empire. And when you have these moments of failure of empire, of retraction of empire, well, then you have this politics. We once were great. And so fundamentally, empire is central to this topic. Although right now, the regimes we're seeing emerge are not going to go in that direction. So that's the general structure. I hope I've given you some picture of the analysis and why I think it applies. It's a good lens by which we can view what I would not describe as populism, but a very particular structure that we face everywhere right now.
So here's what I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about supporting Revolution Books. I want to talk to you about getting into the revolution. I want to talk to you about joining with Refuse Fascism to drive out the Trump-Pence regime. And I'm going to do it as briefly as I can in somewhat in an indicative way because of what I said earlier. This is a very serious time we're in. You need to get involved in these movements now. Don't go about your business and think that someone else is going to take care of this. That someone else is not going to be the Democratic Party. They've already told you that. They tell you that over and over again, but still too many will not listen to this. Nancy Pelosi said even about impeachment that he's not worth it. Well, maybe to her it's not worth it. But if your country has been destroyed by imperialism and you've walked 1,000 miles to get to the U.S. to apply for asylum and now you're in a camp with your children separated, it is worth it. And that's just emblematic of millions of other people in this country. And Bernie and Alexandria, who tell you that they can remake the Democratic Party in your interests, that isn't going to do it either. And you note that they never speak about the interests of all of humanity. And when Bernie was forced to do this around the border, he said, well, we can't let everybody in. Because he's not coming from the perspective of freeing all of humanity. He's coming from the perspective of dividing up the spoils of the system. Bob Avakian said a number of years ago that if you try to make the Democratic Party what they are not, you're going to become more like what they actually are, and that is very true. Think about it. And don't just say, well, I'm really glad you guys are out there and you're on the front lines because then I can go about my business. That ain't going to happen. The revolution and the movement to drive out the Trump-Pence regime is not going to happen without you getting involved. There's a role that we can play in leading this and do play and take responsibility for making analyses and developing program and putting our own bodies on the line, but that's not enough. To drive out this regime is going to take millions of people, and to even prepare for revolution is going to take thousands of people to just get started on that movement to the time when we could actually get rid of the system that's given rise to this fascism. And last, don't step away from the reality that you're facing because it's not happening to you yet. That's unconscionable, it's immoral, and it's going to leave the world in a world of hurt if there is a world to be left. So this is a moment when all of you are needed. Everybody, it is really an all-hands-on-deck moment to spread what you find in this bookstore, to spread the revolution. Whether you agree or not, whether you're just finding out about it, the fact that there's an organization, that there's a bookstore, that there's a place where people are coming to understand why the world is the way it is and how it could be radically different, that matters. And you need to argue with people that they should check it out for themselves and not sit home in the Barca Lounge or whatever else they're sitting on. There's actually a way out for all of this, and I want to speak just for a moment about that. But as I mentioned earlier, there is a new communism, which most of all is a way to understand the world. Bob Avakian has done is he's taken the revolutionary scientific heart of Marxism and he's developed it further, studying those first revolutions, studying from other disciplines, philosophy, different things, and put communism on a much more scientific footing. Stripped it of the religiosity that was part of it, and enables us to understand how the world actually got to where it is. Even the point that Jason made before, that there is just one objective truth, people have different experiences of that. The task of science is to see what the patterns of all that is and to put it together into a coherent picture and then figure out as a revolutionary science of where there are the pathways to change. That's what you have in this new communism. And so it's something that you need to get into. That's why I'm a follower and advocate of Bob Avakian, and it's why you should be a follower too, but you shouldn't take my word for it. You should get into it, and don't walk out of here without getting into it. Get into it. Find out what you agree with, because this hour is late. And understand this fascism that Jason and I are going to get into more deeply now did not just spring out of nowhere. It sprung from the history of this country, but also the underlying economic and political system of this country. It's not how it has been ruled, but it's how it could be ruled, and it's on that road right now. And so this is something you need to look at more deeply, and I would commend to you the talk, The Trump-Pence Regime Must Go. In the Name of Humanity, We Refuse to Accept a Fascist America. A Better World is Possible. This is a film by Bob Avakian. It's available online at revcom.us. Now, quickly, fascism. One aspect of fascism that's spoken to in one of the chapters in Jason's book is that it has to go after critical thinking. It has to undermine critical thinking. It creates a past. He's going to talk more about that when we get into the conversation. But in speaking of going after critical thinking, it has to go after bookstores. That's why you had 12 fascists show up at Politics and Prose in Washington, D.C. That's why you had Revolution Books in Berkeley attacked 10 times by the fascists who were organizing in Berkeley. And why were they organizing in Berkeley? Because Berkeley is known as a center of radical thought. And it just so happens, much to my surprise and delight, that Reiko is here, who's the manager of the Berkeley store. So stand up. For those of you who saw her going cheek to jowl with one of these fascists who threatened to burn down our Berkeley store, and it was a very serious threat, and the community around the bookstore came to its aid, and I went out there right after, and we had a pretty good program, and a lot of people came out, and there was a sense of solidarity, but that doesn't diminish the threat to critical thinking and to the university. So in terms of trying to deal with fascism and fascism in this country, there is, we would submit, only one way to do that. You're not going to vote this out, and waiting till 2020 is a very dangerous course. And Refuse Fascism puts it like this, that the way we have to deal with this is do what seems to Americans to be unthinkable. Get out in the streets. Demand the regime go. But don't just go home the next day and say, well, we did that, look at all the pictures. You have to stay in the streets. If at first it's every weekend, and then it comes to every day, I commend you to watch the film The Square of Tahrir Square. I commend you to take a look at that the people in South Korea drove out their regime by exactly doing this. It took them 3.5, 4 months to do that. Recently in Algeria, all over the world, people have done this. It's only here, in the land of the fatted calf, if you will, not to be too biblical about it, that people haven't seen the necessity of doing this. But that necessity is there, and this is the only way we can do it in sustained, nonviolent mass protests, beginning with thousands of people. I implore you to take a look at the website, refusefascism.org. This is a very important website. There's information there and a stand that you can't find anyplace else. There's 2 writers on that website, Coco Dots and Sarah Rourke, who are almost every week are posting very interesting columns about how to understand what's happening right now. And last, I want to tell you, even though I've mentioned before, what it means to get into BA, to get into Bob Avakian, is to follow your conscience, follow your convictions, get into it, and find out what it's about. And we have something up on RevCom this week that explores it from a book called Science and Revolution by Ardea Skybreak, and she writes this, that one of the most important things it means to get into BA is to get into a deeper analysis, an exposition of precisely why you can't reform the system and why capitalist imperialism as a system needs to be completely dismantled. And through a revolution, you need to do this and replace it with a new society on a completely different economic and political foundation, and correspondingly very different social values and ways that people can relate to each other and function in society. So this is what you have when you come to this store. Now, you should support Revolution Books because authors like Jason Stanley come here and bring really decisive information and perspective to the store. And like we said, he's been in conversation with half the people on our shelves. That is a part of why you should support the store. But you should also recognize how rare it is that there's a place like this. So what you can do is this. Tell your friends about the store. Tell them, never mind that Amazon half-price book. Come here and buy it so that the store can stay open and there can be a center of revolution. Become a sustainer of the bookstore. Monthly sustainers, there's a whole program that you can find out about the counter, and volunteer. Refuse Fascism, go to the website, follow it, join the New York chapter or a chapter wherever you are, and if there isn't a chapter where you are, start one. This is not going to be done by a handful of people. We are not going to drive out the regime that way. And last, if you're interested, and I hope you are, in finding out about the movement for an actual revolution, I am now on a tour. I just got back to New York. The tour is titled, You think you're woke, but you're sleepwalking through a nightmare. This system can't be reformed. We need an actual revolution, and we're getting organized now for that revolution. And you can be a part of that. I'm going to be speaking about that here on Saturday at 3 p.m. So look, with that, I want to thank you for hearing this and for your getting involved, even in the level. It's the start of checking it out further and spreading the word to others, as well as becoming more involved in supporting the bookstore Refuse Fascism and the struggle to end this regime and the struggle ultimately to emancipate all of humanity. So with that, what we're going to do is move some of this furniture around. We're going to have a conversation. It'll go a little bit of time, and then we're going to have a question and answer period where your question, and yeah, I know there's already 2 or 3 hands. I know that everybody here has something to say, and you will all get, well, we'll try to call on as many as we can. But I think right. Yeah. So since you're not, Mike, your sister's bringing up that WBAI is a conduit to the people, and Jason, you were on WBAI earlier this week on Paul DiRienzo's show, and they promoted this program, and that we thank them for that, but it's actually part of what we're doing, and it's also the Pacifica Network Nation in different cities. I've been on KPFK, and Sarah Taylor has been on KPFK, and we've both been on WBAI. She had a regular show on BAI, and then so we do need to get out in the media. Anybody who can help us with that. There's also a video that I was just on with the Young Turks recently. But with that, I want to get to more discussion with Jason, okay? And you want to hear more from me afterwards or come Saturday? Okay, so thank you very much, and we're going to move this around, and then we're going to sit down and talk. I'm stuck in the late 20th century on the technology here, apparently. Okay, so it's all good. People can see, hear, all that kind of stuff. All right, let's get going then. So the first thing I wanted to just ask you about, you've spoken out, obviously, a lot about fascism, so much so that your back is out now from traveling from Europe and back and forth. You've been on media. But I wanted, and you mentioned that, once Madeleine Albright's book came out, it eased a little bit of the pressure, but come on, there's actually got to be what has been, as you go around the country, I guess it's really it's all one question, but there's 3 parts. What's been the pushback that you've gotten on fascism? Or how receptive are people to that this is fascist, that a fascist regime we're facing here and it's spreading around the world? Orban, you mentioned, Erdogan, Duterte, Brazil, all these things that we're talking about. So what is that you're hearing when you're out on the hustings with this book about how people are looking at this fascism, and are they, and in particular, somewhat of a focus in America? Are people facing up to? I have experience too, going out in an organizing capacity, but you're able to speak to them just about these 10 tropes and these 10 frameworks of fascism that the book goes into.
So one thing that's happened is the book's has had a wide international audience. It's been published or will be published in 11 languages. And so a lot of the structure, like in Brazil, they bought the rights and published it in 3 weeks. Sweden, they did it very, very quickly. Spain, the Vox Party arose. So there's a kind of structure that people see. In India, it has gotten great play. BJP, Modi's party, is one of the main examples in the book. So there's been a kind of international, people are familiar with the structure. The media is controlled by the elites. Feminism is ruining the country and the traditions. We once were a great empire. The immigrants are coming. This structure of like the hidden group who's trying to destroy the nation. So I'm getting a lot of collaboration I'm in constant contact with a lot of journalists because a lot of people are trying to figure it out. Like, I spoke with El País the other day and that interview with Andrea Aguilar, and she was like, so how much does Bannon have an influence in Europe? People want to know those structural questions because there's all these links. There's links, when I first started speaking about this 2015, I was brought to the University of Vienna because Freiheitliche Partei Österreich, their far-right party, which famously has got caught into scandal by Spiegel Online last week. But they said to me, I was interviewed by Der Standard, and they said, can you explain to us why every time we say that FPÖ is the Austrian Nazi party, which it is, it's like descended from the Austrian Nazi party and they dog whistle that all the time. The Likud party representatives or Israeli politicians step in and say, no, they're our friends. So what's going on with these kids? So these worldwide, so one thing is I'm seeing a lot of solidarity between people trying to figure out the structure. Like I said, I spoke to a Brazilian journalist about like, how have you guys been fighting off the universities or left-wing indoctrination centers? So as far as I see the works, I see the connection. Suddenly everyone is reading Black Reconstruction, Skip Gates's new book. People are focusing again on Reconstruction. So we're being reminded of the importance of history. We're being reminded that education is always a battleground. So I just got back, like I said, I've just been back from Germany, so I've been defending the, so here a study just came out arguing that countries that face their past more explicitly in their education system have had better resistance to these far-right parties. So compare, for instance, Austria and Germany. Austria, as those of you who've watched the Nazi propaganda movie The Sound of Music know, did not conceive of themselves as a victim of Nazism. So they all are like, yeah, why not bring back the heroic nationalist parties that fought off, whereas Germany has much more of a memory culture. So you see, what I've been most caught with is the international pattern, and how the U.S. fits that, and how our history of struggle, and particularly the Black American tradition, blazes a way forward. But also the right-wing press is kind of scary now. Hi, guys. Like they go after professors for tweets and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, and they've came into the bookstore.
Well, there's a difference between, say, Turning Points USA, which was sort of a fringe organization. Charlie Kirk, they got in the newspapers by the professor watch list, which focused on like many Black studies professors, linked to David Horowitz's Freedom Center. This is and then suddenly they became huge. And like if you look at the attack, and Sessions and DeVos spoke at their conference. You always see Charlie Kirk with Trump. So you see these, so you get the attacks on the universities linking up at the highest level with the White House.
Do people, just one more question in relation to this first question, do people make the links when you're speaking to the two synagogue shootings to Charlottesville and the killing of Heather Heyer? How much does this enter into the conversation in your in your book appearance? Are people seeing this force? How about the Trump rallies? How does that get expressed in the people you're going out to? And what are people thinking? Are they asking you what to do? Or
people do ask me what to do, which is extremely important, and I never say what to do because I think my role is best to just give it my best shot describing social reality and then leave it. It's not my area of expertise. I want to stay scholarly. And I don't think that given what I've done in a scholarly way, look at the history of movements, combine it with the philosophical ideology, connect it to the things in political philosophy, explain the functioning, that doesn't give me a good path forward. People do ask me what to do. That's the next step. And I'm going to become I risk being irrelevant soon because everyone's like, we got it. There's a problem. So it's a very important question what to do. And I have no special answer to that. We don't know, for instance, how people, I'm finishing a book, an academic book on rhetoric. So right now we're at a time where we hear essentially Nazi rhetoric all the time, right? Now in my book, you'll see I argue that what's happened in the United States is we had essentially Nazi rhetoric directed against young black men in the criminal justice system. And, super predator theory, thugs, all of that. So, but, now the charms of fascism, we see it generalized. But what effects, how do we measure that? How do we measure when it has an effect? I mean, how has it inured his supporters to what's happening at the border and the brutalities by which immigrant families have been treated? Or is it having a backlash effect? Are people more aware of bad treatment? So how do we counter rhetoric? That's a question I want to think about. That Harlem has a glorious, lengthy history about how you counter problematic rhetoric using art, and increasingly as the anti-Semitic dog whistles and the international Islamophobia, as all these dog whistles trigger violence. I've been asked to speak on that. So I was asked to speak a lot after Christchurch, because in Christchurch, the author, the killer says, you can call, what is the description of your political philosophy? He says, I'm a fascist. And the killer is obviously imitating Anders Breivik in Norway. The Pittsburgh shooter has the same ideology. The motivation for the anti-Semitic killings is Jews are behind the lax immigration law, as Hitler said, because Jews wanted to destroy Jews, according to white nationalism, wanted to destroy the white race by interbreeding. So I get all of those, and those are in my area. That's what I work on. And a lot of it involves knowing the local history. For example, is Lynn Terrell's paper on the Rwandan genocide, where she explains snakes in Rwanda, to call snakes, killing a snake with a machete is a sign of manhood. Snakes are a real public health threat. So if you call Tutsi snakes, you're representing killing them as like a social and culturally grounded, heroic thing to do. Now, Trump reads the poem The Snake at rallies all the time. But we don't have this, and it's horrifying when he does that. But we don't have the same cultural resonance with that concept. So we have to learn the patterns that our particular culture has that are particularly worrisome. But yeah, and I've gotten my share of online harassment and things like that, but that's just part of being a public figure nowadays.
Just as little aside, if you want to read a little piece on the snake, I believe this is on revcom.us. It's a story from Oscar Brand Jr. wrote that poem, that song.
Yeah.
And his daughter, who has been in programs of Revolution Books and supporter of fascism, wrote a letter that objected to the misuse of that song. So, but let's move on to a different question in terms of some more. We were talking about this over dinner, and potentially some differences here.
Up.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Sorry. Go on.
All right. Well, you want help getting up?
Yeah. I'm good. Go on.
Boy, I better ask a nice question now, huh? We thought that maybe I would get a pantsuit and he could do Donald Trump and I would do Hillary or something, but I didn't want to play that role. So if you people remember the debate. But look, I just want to read something from the introduction that would just get at a point in a question that I want to ask you. And I think it's helpful for people who haven't read the book and aren't that familiar with Jason to get a sense of what his project is here even further. He says that my interest in this book is in fascist politics. Specifically, my interest is in fascist tactics as a mechanism to achieve power. Once those who employ such tactics come to power, the regimes they enact are in large part determined by particular historical conditions. What occurred in Germany was different from what occurred in Italy. Fascist politics does not necessarily lead to an explicitly fascist state, but it is dangerous nonetheless. So I just want to say that I agree actually with that last statement, that doesn't necessarily lead to full-out fascism, but we're going to get to that. That's actually related to my question. But then I agree with that, and I agree with the point that it's determined by particular historical conditions. But I think that, as we were talking about, those historical conditions are ultimately determined. There's a difference between ultimately and historical contingency, what immediately or even over a period of years conditions the development of this. But it ultimately is determined by the actual system, the economic system, the system by what I mean by economic system, the system by which the needs of society are produced, such as today we live under a capitalist imperialist system in this country, and everybody lives under that, whether you're on the imperialist side at the top of the food chain, as we are here, or you're living in Rwanda or the Congo or Myanmar. Yeah, so those are differences, but it is a system. And American, and you also made the point in your talk, but it's also in the book, that the decline of empire is a particularly advantageous time for fascism. And I think these are important points that I agree with. But American democracy, and I think you would agree with this, is founded on the system of capitalism, including at its inception. And at its inception, it actually compromised with the slave system of an economic system, even as the overall economic system was set up to defend property. In fact, Madison's idea is the Declaration of Independence should have said, for the pursuit of life, liberty, and property. Then in the great marketing slogan, they say, why don't you change property to happiness? And the rest is the mass deception of the American people. But nonetheless, it's property of which a whole people were property. So this is, and a very real economic foundation of America. Half of the wealth in this country at the time of slavery was in chattel slaves. So this is a big part of America, as was patriarchy from its inception. And xenophobia at that time directed against the native people, whom a real genocide was committed. So these three things we have identified as the triad of American fascism:
right,
white supremacy, patriarchy, and xenophobia, which took also expression later on in Manifest Destiny and Conquest of Empires, which these are things you talk about. So one of the things that then we, on this basis, and this is all in that film by Bob Avakian I was telling you about before. We have this on the website Revcom all the time. What is fascism? And it says that fascism is the exercise of blatant dictatorship by the capitalist imperialist class, ruling through reliance on open terror and violence, trampling what are supposed to be civil and legal rights, wielding the power of the state, mobilizing organized groups of fanatical thugs to commit atrocities against masses of people, particularly groups of people identified as enemies, undesirables, or dangers to society, all the others that you talk about in your book. And the second paragraph I'm not going to read now, but it talks about how fascism comes in stages. It gets echeloned. It doesn't happen all at once, and not to be fooled by those times when Trump may feel presidential. And of course, the Democrats and MSNBC are always so upset that and Don Lemon, that he's not acting presidential, when it's exactly precisely the point of why he is president, is because he doesn't act presidential. He's trying to bring in a different way of ruling. So I offer this not just because I think that
Do you want me to comment on that definition?
Yeah, well, I do want you to comment on the definition, but let me just say where I want to go with this. First, I would invite you to do this. I wasn't clear you wanted to have that discussion, and that's fine. If you don't, if you do, we can have that definition, discuss that. But then I do want to talk about this question of that could it happen here, and why could it happen here, and at what point does it become too late? Which, as a student, as you are, both from your family's history, but also from your historical background, that, as we know in Nazi Germany, it does become a point when it is too late, when things have gone so far in the cohering norms and rules of society that it becomes much more difficult to stop it. But let's deal with the first question first.
So the first question, so that definition of fascism is a classic, is what's known in the literature as the Marxist definition of fascism. It's the classic Marxist definition. And, Griffin, in this book, he's a scholar of fascism, says, look, there's so many different ideal types of fascism that are each like capture some part of social reality but I think I do actually take issue with the Marxist definition, with the class of definitions of fascism that are the Marxist definition that's characterized here in one essay by Wolfgang Scheuer, I think, as capitalism is the dictatorship of the capitalist class. Sorry, fascism is the dictatorship of the capitalist class that then does anything for their own power. And so I have a piece about this. In May 2018, I was invited to give a talk at this conference in Germany, enormous conference, 1,200 people there, with like Chantal Mouffe and Wendy Brown and Charles Mills, Sally Haslinger, on emancipation, the 50th anniversary of the May 1968 German student movement. And in doing my research, and all the talks were about the emancipation, about anti-capitalism, anti-neoliberalism, anti-imperialism, and no one was making the point that the conference was in Hitler's capital. So this was, the German sanctimoniousness about being virtuous. Like, they even compete about like who the best at saying they're sorry is. So I gave this talk. So when I was doing the research for this, Rudi Dutschke, the leader of the German student movement, he said, as soon as I learned that fascism was just capitalism, I knew I didn't need to read anything more about the Nazis. So, then you look at the German student movement, and the representation of fascism as capitalism made them think of themselves as the real victims. It got to the point where a far left German group bombed a synagogue in Berlin. And then I wrote a piece. I gave a talk, and I wrote a piece for Die Zeit saying we can't, which was published in Die Zeit, saying we can't forget ethnic nationalism, like just brute superiority, like both as a kind of mass politics. Arendt emphasizes in Origins of Totalitarianism. Du Bois, the wages of whiteness point, the psychological wages of whiteness point in Black Reconstruction. There are these cultural battles that become salient under these conditions. And the cultural battles, have to be factored in, and the sort of fundamental superiority point, which is at the heart of the great debate in the Harlem Renaissance, when Alain Locke says, why do we have to talk, if we do our art to aim to try to like convince white people, then we're just reinforcing their sense of superiority. And that's what I argued was going on with Germany. Germans still have deep-seated superiority because they've never faced, like in Germany, the right wing is like, we're the victim of the Berlin Wall. That's why you should never visit the Berlin Wall. And the left wing is like, we're the victims of capitalism. Everybody's a victim in Germany. And then, you know, the Greeks are lazy. What are the Germans doing making national distinctions with an ideology of hard work in the 21st century? You know, like, so they didn't actually address this, you know, this sense of superiority and cultural superiority. And I think that the Marxist definition of fascism doesn't go far enough into the sort of very particular structure. You know, there's this elite group that's controlling things, that's trying to, like, you know, there's a sort of politics of purity there. Now, so I think you've got to theorize the racial element. Now, of course you can say, as you have said, that one way to square the circle here is just to be good about your what racial capitalism. That capitalism has these hierarchies, that capitalism rises with the practice of slavery, that it's mixed in with, it demands a racial hierarchy like colonialism demands a racial hierarchy. So that's one move out, but I think sometimes when I'm in Europe, when I'm only confronting the Marxist definition, and the French give you Hollaback, you know, then like, you guys have a serious ethnic nationalism problem.
See, well, I think one of the first, I'm not going to defend every so-called Euro-communist trend and whatnot. There's been a development, though, of communism, which is important to get into, even including going back to what the actual kernel of Marxism is, and how you understand of capitalism is not just you put it in your book in terms of its class against class. That's what Marxism reduces to, and it becomes just another identity. And then you're trying to negotiate all this. This is all the problem that we have now with intersectionality, which doesn't actually get to what I'm speaking about is the underlying dynamic that the society that we live under it operates under the dynamic of expand or die. One of the developments that in understanding how capitalism works is actually a point that Avakian has emphasized for some time on how to understand the contradiction between, if you will, not if you will, but as you would, I think, acknowledge, that we live under a system where everything is produced socially, but the product of that is appropriated privately by groups of capital and companies, or in, the corporations and in nations. This is how nations arose. There were no nations before capitalism. This is capitalism developed nations. There were areas, national, peoples who lived in different areas who had particular characteristics. And
there were empires.
And there were empires too, based on feudalism, based on slavery.
Well, multi-ethnic communities. But what there were very few of were monolingual, arguably monoethnic countries that were like defined political spaces. Because once you have the defined political space, you tended to have more people living there, more of the European ethnic tribes, or in Africa.
And capitalism brings a lot of that together. But the point is this: that the actual dynamic of this capital accumulation is not just the contradiction or the difference, the exploitation, the contradiction between the capitalists and the workers, which is how Marxism tends to be reduced, but a point that Engels had made that Avakian really emphasizes actually the dynamic fact here, which is what Engels referred to as the contradiction between the organization of producing things at the factory level or at the enterprise level, even at the level of at that level, and the anarchy of the system where the capitalists always are competing with each other.
This is central, and this is the point of the final chapter of my book, where I discuss Hitler's speech to the industrialists, where he says to the gathered industrialists, a little bit of cheating for those of us who do have copies of Hitler's speeches next to our bed. that Hitler tends to bend his message to his audience, but but in his 1932 speech, The Industrialists, that I discuss at length in the final chapter, Hitler says to them, look, you all organize your workplaces with a dictator, according to Der Führerprinzip, the principle of leadership. Once had a German student in my propaganda class, and I was talking about how like none of the stuff they hear at Yale can be translated into German, and he was like, yeah, I know. The president was sort of, one of the administrators was talking about the power of leadership, Führermacht. But yeah, Hitler makes the point that private industry is organized hierarchically with a CEO. So, I mean, he doesn't get into issues of boards of governors or whatever they're called, but or boards, corporate boards, but forget that. He's like, you organize and Peter Thiel talks this way. He has a 2009 speech at Stanford. There's a whole branch of the far right, Nick Land's Dark Enlightenment, that says we're going to replace governments by corporations. He calls them GovCorp. And so he makes that very explicit, the link between, and this is, and democratic theorists, like if you look at Du Bois's Of the Ruling of Men, which is a chapter in Dark Water, which you should buy over there, Du Bois ends with workplace democracy, because he's like, you've got to have workplace democracy in order to have democracy. Jane Addams making a modern Lear about the Pullman strike is all about how Pullman thinks of himself. He thinks he's kind to his workers, but he's not thinking non-democratically. He's thinking like a dictator. So yeah, I agree with you that the structure of the workplace mirrors the structure of fascism.
But that's actually not what I'm arguing.
Okay.
The structure, the fact is the structure is organized at that, and Hitler tries to force it into and make the analogy to the structure he wants at the state. But the fact is that capitalism is a competitive system where it's got an expand or die nature to it.
Yeah.
And it actually incorporates previous forms of oppression, such as the oppression of nationalities. Whites, in this current speech that Avakin's done on why we need a revolution, how you can actually make a revolution, he goes into that white supremacy and capitalism are inseparable. If you tried to get rid of one, you couldn't do it. You have to get rid of both. And this is a point that historically, I think, in the study of Reconstruction, we can make. The reason that Reconstruction, the underlying reason, not the historically contingent reason, the reason why what actually was happening in terms of how parties saw themselves, but the fact is that you couldn't actually emancipate black people under this system without tearing up the whole structure of the country.
I should make one quick point about Avakian. Because of Occupy, I'm actually, and because of the whole fascism thing, the whole idea of a movement with leaders is problematic to me. So I have to admit that. So if we're going to keep mentioning one, I mean, this is a point that Carter G. Woodson makes in The Miseducation of the Negro, that he's like, social movements shouldn't have leaders because, you can kill them, they can die, there's a problem about succession. So I think it's social movements, we've got to theorize, but anyway, that aside. On the underlying point, yeah, I mean, I think we agree. It's just a question of, I remember my only conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's giving a talk, and I just asked him, he's like, I heard you guys in academia argue about whether it's class or race. That's stupid, it's both.
Right.
And so one thing that one does is with racial capitalism, you try to theorize them together, and we already agree about that fundamentally there's a kind of way of looking at liberalism where you put property first, as you pointed out with Madison, and that's intermingled with colonialism, it's intermingled with racial hierarchies. Not necessarily, one has to be careful, but one does have to explain why so many libertarians voted for Trump. Why, there tends to be a spillover between what should be an anti-fascist movement and fascist support. And it's where you put your finger on it. It's the competition. It's the social Darwinism. It's the principle that it's all about competition and winning and domination.
So see, what this quote is actually getting at, then we can move on to, let's continue with what's in the book, but is getting at that yes, there is, how the U.S. society has been ruled up till now is by an essential liberal consensus, even as they switch parties and there's conservative and different trends. But this is a way, a belief that you could actually, you have certain cohering norms, which even David Fromm, who was the speechwriter for Bush, and then I guess now was a co-editor at The Atlantic and makes a lot of money on CNN or wherever he speaks, said that, look, the separation of powers is a metaphor, which he has a point there. But there's so cohering norms where you can pay a certain amount of lip service to and have a language of inclusion, of multiculturalism, multilateralism in foreign affairs, and how foreign policy is conducted. You put maybe at different times, when particularly of prosperity, certain limits and redistribute some of the social product. You have Social Security, Medicare. That's not what the normal program of the conservative is. But what fascism is a different way of going at it. Same system, not a different system. They're not actually, as you point out, they're not actually socialists. They're not actually communists. But you actually have a system where it's a much more open. By the way, it's a really important point to just remember that no fascist governments have ever been like together with the socialists or the communists. They've always killed the socialists and the communists. So when your friends are you're like, actually, no, it's the Catholic Church that, linked up. Of course, Catholic Church has been anti-fascist in certain elements, but it's the religious right, it's big business. But most decisive times, the Catholic Church has always aligned itself with fascists, from Argentina to Italy to Germany.
Coalition building.
Coalition building among the fascists. But the point is that there is a qualitative difference. And look, I just want to be very straight with the audience that should this move to all-out fascism, should they consolidate this, it probably that will mean the end of this bookstore, at least in this form. You're going to have to do some work to find wherever we are at that point. And it's going to change a lot of the rules of the game, not the underlying system. But our point here, just at Revolution Books, while I am working as hard as I can to unite people of all different points of view, people who believe in this system and think it can be an instrument for change, and those like myself who don't think that, we have to be working together, to be driving out this regime. But I don't want to go back to that. I don't want the future to be what happened before Trump.
You can't because that led clearly to Trump.
That led to Trump. That's precisely the point, which is why here we represent and are trying to fight for a third future, a future of a radically different society and an actual revolution, which is the key point I wanted, that I wanted to bring into the conversation. And I'm glad you wanted to talk about this, because I think it's important. No, this is a very important discussion we're having. And if we're being a little abstract for people, we can break it down later on. It's very important. The future, actually, I don't think we have a difference that should this consolidate, that the dangers to the planet, the dangers to humanity are immense right now.
Yeah, if you look at what unifies all the far-right movements across the world is, if I were Tim Snyder, I would say two things usually. He's like, well, don't forget they all are connected with Russia. All right, there's that. But forget that. That's not what I do. Okay, the three things, because they're all anti-immigration. They all are doing climate change denial.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's been, when I left Germany on Friday, there was a it was 2 weeks ago on Friday, there was a big headline in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Süddeutsche Zeitung, I forgot what, about, the far right discovers a new politics, and it's all about, they've been advised by the Heartland Institute, the Koch brothers funded Heartland Institute with this politics, to say that, I talk about this in my book, to represent climate change as I here in the book, in the chapter on unreality. I talk about how Tony Perkins says climate change is about, the gay agenda. Because it's a lifestyle change. It's trying to make you change the whole way that you operate, that you behave. And so when I left Germany, there were all these far-right politicians saying they want to get you to stop hunting. You know, they want you to get you to like not use. There won't be any bags anymore, things like that. So yeah, it's all part of the destruction of reality and the denial. Like the you know, climate change is on the side of them. So they're bad, so it isn't happening.
So just I have two more
And
questions.
that's because of who they're paid for.
I think that's an important point. But what about this question, you know, which is as a personal dimension for you as well, when you speak of your grandmother and her memoir, your grandfather coming here at 7 years old in 1939.
My father.
Your father, yeah. 1939.
And my mother lived through the war in Poland and Russia.
So you look at that arc from Hitler coming to power, being, you know, and the compromises that were made in 1933, and your father comes in 1939, and you know, in reading different books, there becomes a point when it can become too late to stop it.
I'm just going to read from George Orwell's review of 1940 review of Mein Kampf. It is a sign of the speed at which events are moving that Hearst and Blackett's unexpurgated edition of Mein Kampf, published only a year ago, is edited from a pro-Hitler angle. The obvious intention of the translator's preface and notes is to tone down the book's ferocity and present Hitler in as kindly a light as possible. For at that date, 1939, Hitler was still respectable. He had crushed the German labor movement, and for that the property-owning classes were willing to forgive him almost everything. Both left and right concurred in the very shallow notion that National Socialism was merely a version of conservatism.
So it can become too late.
Yes, but it's also the case that the Nazis are, you know, we've lived through the, I mean, it's our history, so we can't, no, I don't think it will come too late. I mean, look at what Black Americans have done in a country that tried to eradicate them. You know, you could have said it was too late, but they fought. So I don't think it's too late. And Hitler's a very extreme version of fascism, which is why sometimes people are like, okay, he's not a good model. I mean, Mussolini committed ethnic genocide in East Africa,
right? But
you know, he didn't until the end really. I mean, it was very oppressive, but you know, things can get bad without like there being mass genocide.
Look, I agree that it's different forms it takes, but one of the big differences that we face here is the actual. I mean, this is your point on particular historical experience. Germany was a defeated power. It's coming, and it had to do a whole thing to remake society. They had to.
Yeah, no one's going to invade us, so well, that's the problem. I mean, I think that's good.
That's right, but there are great horrors that happen, and you know, if we look at different countries, they're happening right now in Turkey and and certainly in Philippines.
It can go really fast, and it's not happening like in Turkey. I don't think my book couldn't be published in Turkey right now, without a doubt. They just annulled an election. Hungary, but we have an old history with this, like voter suppression, the tactics we're doing now, the census stuff that they're talking about. We don't need to learn that from Europe. This is how we always did it in the United States, by creating a white electorate, by gerrymandering, by use of the prisons, by making voting incredibly difficult. So it's our old school way of doing it.
I agree with you here. We have the convict labor. You have the history of black people in this country is a history of most unspeakable horrors on the one hand, and also heroic struggle. But the point is, we have to get to the end of such a struggle, and not the end being a genocide. What you even see is a slow genocide. Really, you were mentioning this whole his theories of super predators that led to, or as a justification for this mass incarceration. I want to come to one more question so we can open it up to the audience, and that is, there is a moral, which I think you've gathered from Jason's remarks, a moral dimension to this book. And just say when I came back late on a plane and I sort of read the whole thing through in a sitting, and it was, it's a lot of it sitting here, but I thought that the moral dimension is something I wanted to speak about. And when we started Refuse Fascism, we did a teach-in, and one of the people, myself and a climate scientist, and George Prochnik, who a writer for the New Yorker, but he's actually a Jewish scholar, he wrote a book, a biography of Stefan Zweig, who was a very famous novelist in Austria, which Jason mentioned earlier, actually the most famous, and he was the toast of the town, kind of a big deal. And Zweig wrote a memoir. I guess I should tell you the history of Zweig. He wouldn't believe this was happening. He eventually had to flee, came to the United States, wrote his memoir in a little house up by Sing Sing, and eventually went down to Brazil and committed suicide in great despair. But he began his memoir, that this is, I didn't know this, but Prochnik writes about this, with a quote from Shakespeare's Cymbeline, "And meet the time as it seeks us." And then he wrote right before he died, "I imagined experiencing a second renaissance of humanity, and I have lived to see how it falls to pieces." So I wanted to speak a little bit about this provocation of meet time as it sees us in relationship to the last paragraph of the introduction, which I don't want you to think I only read the introduction. See, I read the whole book. I mean, actually, there's a little side. I once met with a very famous guy who was on TV, and he said, I just started working at the bookstore, and he said, he says, "How you doing?" Because he knew me more as an activist, and I said, "Well, man, I read all these books." He said, "What do you mean you gotta read all these books?" I said, "Well, I have authors coming on." He says, "It's like I go on TV every day, I talk about, read the introduction, read the last paragraph, and you're done." I said, "Oh, no, that's not how we're going to do it at Revolution Books, okay? Because people, if we're selling books, we're not selling articles here, okay? And it matters, all 10 things that Jason talks about are important. But you're right, that fascism today might not look exactly as it did in the 1930s, but refugees are once again on the road everywhere. In multiple countries, their plight reinforces fascist propaganda that the nation is under siege, that aliens are a threat and danger both within and outside their borders. The suffering of strangers can solidify the structure of fascism, but it can also trigger empathy once another lens is clicked into place. And so I think, we've talked a little bit here about difference. I think that, but also unity. In other words, this empathy is very important. I would submit that to really have empathy for all of humanity, you can try to do it, but you can't actually practice it under a system of exploitation and oppression, which is what capitalism and imperialism is. At the same time, I think it's very important that this morality comes through in the book of the need for empathy, and that the lack of it that is demonstrated by people not moving at a time like this. I mean, there are stories now finally being told of what it means to be a woman and not be able to control and to stop a pregnancy that's unwanted. And where the fucking debate, I guess we can do that on Facebook, right? Where the debate is on over whether it should include an exclusion for rape or incest and not over the fundamental right to be a human being and control your own body. This is an absurd and horrific time, not to even mention these immigrants, which we do have to mention. So I just wanted to, before we open it up, to speak about this dimension of the book, and we can have our differences about, to fully have that empathy for humanity as a whole requires this different system that privileges and that actually is based on meeting the needs of humanity, not just their material needs, but actually their needs for culture and for science and for art, to be able to imagine what the world could be. And that this is a big part of what underlies, yes, and
meeting the needs of humanity is meeting our needs for time away from work. And that's
right.
Why fascism has, at its very heart, struggle. Like the idea is, when you read Mein Kampf, it's very harsh. It's like, humans want to struggle, they want battle, they don't want comfort and time. But actually, you could have a different view that they do want comfort and time, and the weekend is a great thing, and we've handed it back way too easily. So I mean, I remember my parents told me about the weekend, and it sounded great. Like on Friday, you're done with work. So fascism sort of privileges work and it privileges struggle and early death. You know, in the Bannon movie, you know, that Errol Morris did, American Dharma, Bannon is like, people don't want like, you know, an easy life. They want like, you know, they want to fight for meaning and die. And so now on the general question, that's going to be too hard philosophically to adjudicate here. Mm-hmm. Is capitalism responsible for the lack of empathy? It depends on how you think of capitalism. I mean, we can't forget that sometimes capital ends up accidentally, perhaps, resulting in challenging structures of oppression, like there was times when or imperialism has these weird effects where you have to address the problem of racism in the 1960s because otherwise you're getting really bad press. So sometimes the forces of capitalism, Disney says we're going to leave Georgia. We're not going to film in Georgia. So, you know, and we put pressure on capital to do that. And originally, here I am, only revolution books would make me defend capitalism. I'm a philosopher. I have never done this before. Keep it amongst yourselves. This is what? So,
well, welcome to our house. Where
so Adam Smith says contracts enforce empathy, because if you make contracts with someone, you have to imagine yourself in their position, and it'll force you to be fair and see things from their position in order to make a contract with them. Now you can say he was wrong, but that was his idea. So it's just, as a philosopher, to sort of divorce, to say if capitalism is responsible for the elimination of empathy, it's ironic, since some of the central theorists of empathy were using it to undergird a vision of capitalism that doesn't look anything like there's no inheritance, we all start from the same place, and then, you know, so that's...
Well, that, right, here's an invitation. That, we'll let you recoup that, and we can come back at some point. No, this is an important
the
conversation
empathy,
to understand what capitalism does. Capitalism does clear the ground. You know, capitalism clears the ground of a lot of traditional ideas and relationships. It clears the ground of all of that. That's where these theorists that you quote, Locke and Montesquieu, people like that, they come in. They actually theorize this, and it's a tremendously creative as well as a tremendously destructive system. The point is this, that we can do better than that. Now that's, and so that, now we can have an argument about whether that's going to require leadership or not, and it's an important argument. It's actually a very crucial argument to have, and we're not going to have it right now because I want to open it up to discussion. I would recommend, though, I just rewatched this film called The Square, that it is one of these things where, you know, I won't say I was practically moved to tears when I think of the heroism that people put into that struggle, but had no idea of the necessity for leadership, and then what kind of leadership. And they were forced to rely on leadership that was really bad leadership, and then they clearly didn't recognize the leadership they were getting from the military. So we can talk about, this is a very important discussion to have in this country about leadership, no leadership, horizontalism, what's wrong with that, or what's right about it. We can talk about all of that. And there is, I'll just say, well, there is actually a different concept of this in the book, The New Communism, on the contradictions of leadership, that you need it, but it also can be, it is, yes, it's problematic, but exactly how and why a scientific approach to it is actually the way forward. But let's hear from you.
Don't follow me.
Yeah.
I don't.
Let's follow you.
I nap too much.
Okay. So I'm going to take questions from the audience. I've got some from that came in online, but I want to actually get questions from the room. Now, he had a question. There was, yeah. Go ahead, and then the woman. One thing before the questions: people should use the microphone, otherwise it won't be heard. Okay, even though we can hear you in the room, they can't hear you online. So wait for the microphone.
Okay, I actually have two questions, if that's okay. They're different questions, but two questions came to mind I was hoping you could talk about. So the first thing is, I've had a suspicion, or some people have talked about it, and you have little hints of things from history, like about Hitler's anatomy, and now about Trump, and when Trump when he announced he was running, one of the very first things he talked about was that this idea of rape, and it seems like it all sort of comes back to this sexual threat that really gets into something that we're hardwired to react with aggression.
Chapter 8 of my book is called Sexual Anxiety.
Okay, yeah, and it seems like maybe there's like sexual feelings of sexual inadequacies that a lot of these people who follow this seem to have, and that Trump seems to help them out with, I guess, or make them feel that they have some kind of sexual power. And but also the leaders themselves seem to have some issue. If we could talk to their doctor, I'm not trying to be funny, but I mean maybe
No,
this
it's
is
a central. Chapter 8 of my book is about that. It's about the patriarchal father, the macho politics, the fear. Maria Schmidt, can I have the book for a second? Maria Schmidt, who Orban put as the head of the Hungarian Holocaust Museum, and who is a very scary person. Here's what she says about Angela Merkel's decision to admit, Schmidt's enemies in her book are Muslim immigrants, left-wing liberal elite, and George Soros. Schmidt writes in this book she wrote about the German decision to admit 1 million Syrian refugees. A normal man or boy will know his duties and defend his wife, daughter, mother, or sister. Only these Germans of today have turned so brainwashed and unmanly that they are not even capable of that. You look at the Hutu 10 Commandments, they're all about machismo, protecting the Tutsi women are not fit to be wives and mothers, Hutu women must be protected, etc. It's very central that you get people, incensed against the minority group men as potentially destroying the purity of your greatness of your country. And then the liberal elite, Jews, if you're an anti-Semite, are behind this as a plot. That's why the Pittsburgh shooter hated the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society.
And the second question I have is, there have been some people talking about how...
So just, we will not replace you. I always ask my students, what is we will not replace you? Jews will not replace us. It doesn't mean that Jews will have lots of kids. It means that Jews on this white nationalist ideology are going to bring in non-whites to destroy the white race by having them intermingle with the women. So it's very central, to the point where Wilhelm Reich's The Mass Psychology of Fascism, Wilhelm Reich's Freudian psychoanalysis, is all about, quite reductive, reducing fascism just to the sexual dimension.
The second question is, there's been some discussion now from some people where this idea of patriotism, right, has been owned a lot of times by the right, or maybe patriotism isn't actually the right word for what they do, where they talk about they glorify the country, but
nationalism.
But there's some people are saying that it's been a mistake for people on the left not to at least talk about some things. Otherwise, they're just going to lose a lot of people, because there are at least some things that you can talk about, or at least the ideals. If maybe we're not always living up to our ideals, but things about the country that we should, people died fighting fascism.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Right,
totally.
so...
Patriotism, well, you just answered your question, absolutely right. So the standard line on this is, look at what Frederick Douglass, look at what civil rights movements have done, civil rights movement and the abolition movement, abolition of slavery movement did. Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July," is the classic citation here. It's like, you bring me to talk, it's 1852. You bring me to talk about liberty, is this a joke? Your liberty is my enslavement. And so what he's doing is he's using the hollowed, and he's like, he knows perfectly well that the founders were there to protect the practice of slavery and use the democratic vocabulary hypocritically. But he sort of says, he represents it as an honest mistake, that there are these ideals that America represents. And Du Bois in Souls of Black Folk writes that way as well, rhetorically, to lean into the democratic ideals. And so to represent American patriotism as patriotism to those liberal ideals. And yes, that's like, you know, and that's why it's so dangerous when we have a president who talks just of nationalism and Stephen Miller says, you know, he's right, but he like attacks the Statue of Liberty, says it's not about immigration. It's right, it's about abolition of slavery, but it was added in 1905, but it still is a powerful symbol. So you have these attacks on the ideals now, on liberalism, on liberal ideals. And so to remind people of the connection between America and liberal ideals is important. So that's absolutely right. And some people might say, oh, you're a hypocrite, you're, you know, because liberal ideals were used to justify slavery, to which I'll say, take that to Frederick Douglass, because that's what he used. And if you don't have the liberal ideals, if you just have the destruction of the liberal ideals, of truth, of liberty, I mean, it is true that they just renamed gas, what do they call it, freedom energy, freedom molecules. But it's true that the language of liberty is hypocritically misused, Operation Iraqi Freedom, but giving it up, you know, the left typically has, much of the left has used that vocabulary and then used it to accuse people of hypocrisy, and that's powerful.
Let's see some other hands. I'd like to see how many hands there are altogether. Okay, well, let me just take it right here.
Yeah. Hey, how you doing,
Good.
Professor?
Good, how are you?
Good. First, I hope you're back as well.
What?
I hope your back gets better.
Thank you.
Would the stool help?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I sort of had two questions. The first one is, I don't really like the first one too much, but I'm asking anyway. One of the core tenets of democracy is this, having this free space for public discourse and, or quote unquote free speech, right? And I think you display pretty well in your book that fascism or fascist politics sort of relies on this free space in order to, I guess, to develop this unreality concept, right? Or a mythic past, or whatever have you. Yeah. So, how do you deal with the tension between a free public space and basically fascist politics? That's my first question.
Here's how you deal with it.
Oh yeah, I know. Just that's the first thought I had. Do you want me to ask a second one?
What else should I mean, after that's to take me like a second.
The second question I had was on statelessness as defined by Arendt. Do you believe that in the international rise of fascist politics, that especially thinking in terms of creating a boundary within a nation state, that there are people who might be considered stateless, however, not in the same sense of being abandoned by a land or a state, but as being stateless within a state? That's sort of how I'm thinking about it, and I'm trying to see whether or not you agree with that way of thinking. So those two questions.
Yeah, very easy. So the first question is, what about the relationship between free speech and democracy? Democracy free speech is central to democracy. You can't envisage democracy without free speech. This is less famously the subject of my book, How Propaganda Works, which begins with, I think I quoted here, it begins with this as, so Goebbels, he's cited a lot here, but Goebbels, 17. Goebbels says, I'm not going to be able to find it. But 3260. So, right. Right, here it is. This will always remain one of the best jokes of democracy, that it gave its deadly enemies the means by which it was destroyed. So what he means is free speech. And as Ruth Ben-Ghiat pointed out on an MSNBC panel we were on together, there's a 1929 Nazi poster that has Hitler with like his mouth sealed. He's been silent. So this is just an age-old tactic. Streicher was accused of violating hate speech laws and put on trial, like, you know, oh, they're banning free speech, meaning they're not letting the Nazis speak. And so, but, you know, this is not something we're going to solve here in Revolution Books on 132nd Street and Lenox Ave, because it's book 8 of Plato's Republic. You know, this is Plato's argument against democracy. Like, that's not going to work, because you'll just get, because people are divided, and you'll just get a demagogue coming and taking over by lying to people. Yeah, so, you know, so that's why, you know, that's why Rousseau in The Social Contract says people mock the system that I'm describing here, democracy, because they say a wizard with words will just come and trick people into voting for him, and then we'll end democracy. But, and then Rousseau says, the trick is eliminating ideologies that divide people and having equality. Yeah, that's, democracy is supposed to only work when you have equality and no divisions between people, and at most 7,000 people, I think, or maybe 10,000. So yeah, so this is a fundamental problem, because you can't envisage democracy without free speech. So this is democracy's strength and weakness. Now, I think the typical thing, the thing that Arendt would say is, you know, well, you have to, what the Russians discovered, well, on the Russians discovered, I talk about this in my book. Does anyone remember the original name, the original slogan of Russia Today? Question more. So the idea was, have everybody on. You know, people are like, yeah, but they have some good people on RT. Yeah, they do. They also have people who are, let's say, untethered from reality. So the idea is to make you destabilize, to destabilize truth. So yeah, so that's on the second, on the question of statelessness. Well, Jews were the classic sort of stateless people. And you know, I was just telling that to my wife. I was like, yeah, we didn't get last name until 1812. People forget how recent it was. And Roma to this day are often like stateless, you know, or stateless. But yeah, I mean, that's going to be a complicated question. I think there are. It's hard to map. It's hard to like map the class. We're talking historical differences. Like, we had these stateless people who then could be represented by fascist politics as not having a soul, because, you know, that's the important thing to add to modify the Marxist definition of communism. There's this idea of that you get your identity from the soil, from the nation, and that doesn't merely, you know, come from capitalism, I think. Or we could argue about that more all day, all night.
Yeah, we're in Columbia.
Yeah, Columbia.
Thank you. I am a current grad student. Thank you for the talk. My question is, I'm currently at Teachers College, so my focus is mainly around education. And I'm wondering, what roles do you see public institutions like public schools, where it serves almost a third of the country, where you are in or compulsorily, you know, required to be there from the ages of at least maybe 5 to 16. What roles do public institutions serve in either fighting against fascism or even instituting fascism, given that, you know, the private Christian institutions were kind of the housing where you were able to get away from that democratic control of what curriculum looks like, and you're able to kind of found where a lot of these, you know, far-right movements I think are tied to that Christian fundamentalism. And so where exactly does public education fall in your view?
Oh, great. You ended on a move to which is absolutely, which I hadn't expected, and which is your point that the very idea of a secular public education is vital for democracy, because and I think that's right. For instance, what the Christian faith has is it has at the bottom an authority structure to God, but And that is going to link, that's why you do find Christian fundamentalists and religious fundamentalists often siding, and obviously the ultra-Orthodox party in Israel, siding with essentially fascists. And the secular education doesn't put anything other than truth at its core, or shouldn't. But of course, so the last chapter of my book, How Propaganda Works, is about, this is your field, not mine, but is about the cardinal principles of secondary education, the 1918 document that establishes junior high school and the curriculum for the public schools. And so, you know about the social studies history war, right? In like 1915. So the idea was, so Dewey, who founded Teachers College, right? I don't know if he founded, but he was, but prominent, certainly a prominent professor. That's back when they would not have been surprised by philosophers talking to audiences like this. So Dewey took the wrong side of the history social studies war, which was, well, I'm so excited by your question, I'm spilling over. So when I showed Chomsky the manuscript for How Propaganda Works, and he says to me, you cannot write a book on propaganda without having a chapter about the education system or the media. And I said, well, you already wrote that book with Edward Herman, Manufacturing Consent, about the media. He said, so write a chapter on the education system. So I was like, I don't know anything about the education system. He said, start anyway. Now, my dad was a sociology professor. He's an East Africanist, and then he became a sociologist after 10 years in the East African Studies department. And I inherited like 25, I got like 20, small selection of his huge collection, 2,500 of his books. And he had a set of boxes on education. And so after that discussion with Chomsky, I came home and I opened it. And the first book was an old book from 1901 called Social Control, and by a Stanford professor, Neil Wilson, or that's the wrong ant guy, but I don't know. So I forget his exact name, Roth maybe. And each chapter was how best to do social control. The thing about reading like that time from 1895 to 1920 is they're super explicit about stuff. So, the problem for democracy is that there's all these dumb people. Like, we can't let them vote. So what I do, and he's like, each chapter, he's like, well, churches, are they good for some? No, because churches sometimes valorize poverty rather than wealth, and is this system? And then he finally ends up, I think, in chapter 16 on the school. He's like, you have institutions that force people to their kids, they send their kids to these schools. So you have them as a captive audience. And so the cardinal principle, this is the last chapter of How Propaganda Works, is all about this story. Instead of history, they decided to teach social studies. And social studies would be a uniform story about American values. And Dewey got snookered. The great paper by David Smedden called How Dewey Lost. So David Smedden, the Stanford, or When Dewey Lost. Something. You can email me. And Dewey thought that social studies was going to be a way of like everyone would learn to form culture together. But instead it was like a top-down, no, this is America. And that's why we get these fights all the time. Like, we're supposed to assimilate the immigrants, uniform narrative. So at its best, the education system, this is what Du Bois is railing against in the final chapter of Black Reconstruction. You got to teach history as history, not as a way of social cohesion. And Dewey got, it's a more complicated story because they gave Dewey 12th grade. So the textbooks for 12th grade social studies in the 1920s were actually very cool. They were like, here's how you shape public opinion. And they were like really, but yeah, the education system, one thing I've learned by going from country to country is at the center of every fight around the world is the education system. So, in Hungary, Orban just now took control of the National Academy of Sciences. Even under the communists in Hungary, they didn't take control of the National Academy of Sciences. Changed elementary and secondary school teaching. Turkey, same thing. That's the fight in Germany. How much Holocaust education should we do? As we know, the United States. I learned, I'm in my mid-40s, but I will soon be in my early 50s in the next few months. But right now I'm in my mid-40s, so I remember learning that Reconstruction failed because black people weren't ready for democracy. So but yeah, the education system, that's what it's about. And I see the effect. Back when I was on Facebook, I would see the effects of the bad history teacher I had. Well, he was a Nazi. He wasn't really bad. I mean, he was a good Nazi. But he was like, you can't really kill that many people so quickly. He was denying the Holocaust. So but I still see people saying things like, wasn't Hitler Jewish? From my high school class. I'm like, no, actually, that's not true. And so yeah, education is like, it gives people this basic background. And if they're unmoored on that basic background, like, it's vital. That's why the battles are about the education. That's why Bolsonaro is going after the education system. And there are these complicated issues about, do we feel proud, ashamed, or proud? Same issue everywhere, like in Germany with the Nazi past.
Just before I call on you, this is just to your question. This is a very important battleground, and including the kind of work you're doing in graduate school, but also if you go into the field, is what that education is going to be, and it's very sharply joined now with just to return to another thing, a core part of the fascism in America. Why, in fact, Trump was able to ascend to be president. There's his particular characteristic as somebody who's willing to break all the rules, somebody who will not abide by anything. It's kind of, people say he doesn't play by the rules. He's kind of a bit of a psychopath, and never has that disqualified somebody from being a fascist leader. In fact, it's part of in the job description. But the alliance he made upon winning that nomination was with Mike Pence as a representative of a trend of Christian fascism that's been developing in this country. In one sense, it goes all the way back. You can find the antecedents of it back into its origins, Civil War, post-Civil War, all, but it's in particular
the 1930s
and to the 1930s, Father Coughlin. But then in the 60s and late 70s,
wasn't as bad as the Protestant version. I forget his name now, but who was even more powerful.
Right, I can't remember either. But in the late 1970s, these ex-Goldwater people developed a plan. And Reagan became the spokesperson, another person who was not actually religious but formed this initial alliance. Anyway, long story short, over a period of several decades, there has been a particular political form of Christian fundamentalism that more accurately should be called Christian fascism. That one of the pillars of it has to do the remaking of the education system, which has to do with this is Betsy DeVos's entire fucking mission and why she's there, and the charter schools.
Does everyone know where the DeVos family fortune comes from?
Well, on her end, it comes Amway, and then on the
Dick DeVos. Yeah. Well, right. I mean, she's Eric Prince's sister, so that, but.
Right, but they both come out of the and these people are very tied in with the Koch brothers, and it's a section of the U.S. ruling class has decided that this would be a section that hasn't been in dominant power, but has been accruing power, that this would be the way to make American empire sustain through this era of globalization and in competition with the Chinese. I just read a speech, which I really passing by, I have a copy of it, by Mike Pence in October of 2018, talking about China. But all of this he wraps in religious language. It was to the Hoover Institute, which is Hoover Hudson. I think it was to the Hoover Institute at Stanford. Anyway, it's a very interesting, very fucked up speech, but it's very interesting in terms of he wraps the whole foreign policy in this Christian fundamentals, and then he ties it to the education. So the battle that you're fighting right now is, or should be fighting, and hopefully are fighting, is very central to this. And here's something. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to just end this on this one point here. It's very important that some of the discussion we've had here on objective truth, because you do have to hear voices who've been excluded from the discourse. But just because your experience as a child of the Holocaust or a second-generation child of the Holocaust is different than her experience as somebody coming from a Chicano background, my experience, your experience. We're all very different, but there's just one reality. And if you start getting into a relativism that there's your truth and my truth, then you're on the same ground as these fascists. You're on the same epistemological ground as these fascists, and that's a very important part of what we actually struggle for in this store. There's probably more disparate viewpoints and experiences, more literature from the various diasporas in this store, but we don't actually say that they each tell the full truth. They actually need to be sifted through and combined to be able to understand the history of humanity, and this is something that you should do with education.
Du Bois's essay of the ruling of men, available on Darkwater on this book.
So look, Jason's been nice enough to come here and stand for the entire program. So what I'm going to propose is that we actually sign books at the podium, and we should try to do this more quickly. Come on Saturday if you want to hear about the tour to organize for an actual revolution, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for